The problem with the BBC and the people who are now lining up to attack it once it's down, the Spectator columnists, the GB News presenters, the BBC insiders, even people drawing comparisons with local politics. It's all the same mental furniture, the same hierarchies, the same tones of superiority, the same habit of talking about the public from a height. The row is being sold as left versus right. In reality, it's also about class, profession, and the way the London media talks about itself. What actually happened is that two very senior people at the BBC, Tim Davie, the Director General, and Deborah Turnus, the head of news, have stepped down after the Panorama film about Donald Trump was shown to have spliced two separate parts of his 6th of January speech in a way that made the call to march look more immediate than it was. The chairman, Samir Shah, has now apologised for an error of judgment and said the edit could give a misleading impression. Well, it did give a misleading impression. It's not about could, it did, and it was intentional. That's what edit means. The edit was then tied to a leaked impartiality dossier by Michael Prescott, which said this was not a one-off but part of a wider editorial habit on Trump, Gaza and gender. Under combined pressure, Trump threatening a $1 billion lawsuit, the Telegraph splash, Conservative board members and internal BBC resistance, the top two fell. There were cheers. On its own, splicing two bits of archive together is a kind of thing you fix with a caption and a brisk apology. It exploded because it unplugged straight into a pre-existing charge sheet. The BBC's own advisor had written that on certain hot files it keeps choosing the same framework. Trump's people say it shows anti-Trump bias. GB News says it proves ideological capture. The Spectator says it proves a deeper rot in hiring, subject choice and language. Even The Guardian, which is sympathetic to the BBC at the moment, admits the broadcaster is now leaderless and in a fight over impartiality. In other words, the edit became proof of pattern. And two attacks have been happening at the same time. The outside attack from Trump, the Telegraph, Boris Johnson from the sidelines, GB News presenters telling viewers that they've been vindicated and so on. Trump wants to turn this into the BBC tried to rig the 2024 election against me, so I will take $1 billion off them. It's political theatre, but it lands because the BBC has admitted the underlying edit was wrong. And then there's the inside attack, the board members such as Robbie Gibb, who and those who think the BBC has drifted into intersectional race and gender first journalism, and they use the moment to say this is exactly the kind of thing that we've been warning about. News management resisted, saying there is no institutional bias. Deborah Thingamy said that specifically, I think, on GB News. That standoff is what forced the resignations, not Trump alone. Where the GB News and the Spectator come in, well, it's interesting. Listen to a run of GB News shows on this and read the Spectator's pieces and you hear the same structure. The BBC is too big, too certain of its virtue, too quick to believe the newest ideological fashion, too slow to admit error. The difference is tone. GB News makes it moral outrage. We are forced to pay for propaganda. The Spectator makes it constitutional. A body funded by all cannot speak like a London NGO, but the skeleton is the same. And it's the same skeleton that you heard when when we were talking about officials being idiotic with people who were not born here. It's the tone of people who think they own the room. So is this left versus right? Well, not neatly. One of the odder details is that Keir Starmer's government has not joined the feeding frenzy. Downing Street has said the BBC is not corrupt, which is quite a generous line. Lisa Nandy has scolded GB News, yet at the same time Labour ministers have been muttering for months about BBC standards that have slipped. So the split is not simply Labour loves BBC, the Conservatives hate it. The split is between those who want the BBC to admit it has an internal cultural tilt and those who want to keep saying problems are isolated mistakes. The resignations happened because those two views met head on. And there's a deeper thing, a deeper British thing here, that that is politics at human scale. What we're watching here is politics at a professional scale. People who have been to the same universities, sit on the same boards, marry media lawyers, think that their instincts are neutrality. Whether they're at the BBC, The Spectator or GB News, they often share the same idea that Britain is somehow something to be managed. And people who came here more recently, people who look in, or people who feel oppressed by this system, hear this tone of management immediately, and they're not imagining it. At the moment, there's a big question about, can the BBC be saved? Can it be saved from what is perhaps part of the question? If it wants to remain a compulsory universal broadcaster, it has to do three things very, very fast. It has to own the bias in plain English instead of the usual formulations. We have been quicker to platform some causes than others. We will publish the metrics. Please forgive the specificity. They do not forgive. They do not forgive the fog. They expect us to forgive these specific problems. But the Prescott dossier is already out there. Better to publish it than to leak it. We need to see the information that is being sifted and presented to the BBC itself, and that may not be all of it. That's the problem. Remember, the Prescott thing is an internal document. We need to shrink the thing that you cannot police. A body with 20,000 staff cannot promise line by line to be impartial. Every serious critic this week has said some version of the BBC is too big. That is right. What I find so extraordinary about the BBC is it doesn't actually produce very much. It outsources production, and then it puts its stamp all over it, like The Traitors, for example. Produced outside. Like the shows that I've been involved with over the years, all produced outside, and then at the last minute, the BBC are crawling all over it and demanding changes. We need to appoint somebody who is visibly not of the culture, of the current culture. Trevor Phillips was floated for exactly that reason. He knows journalism, he's not frightened of arguments about race and gender, and he would signal a break. If it cannot or will not do that, then the subscription argument becomes stronger, because people will say, if you want to do campaigning journalism about gender, Gaza and historical reparations, pay for it with people who choose you, not with court-backed license threats. There was a debate on GB News where somebody came in and was saying that he contacted the BBC about race and about slavery issues, and said these are contested issues. You're presenting them as facts. And when it comes to America, I think the whole thing is even scarier than when the BBC is dealing with history. That is why Trump is leaning so hard on this. He wants to export the US media war to London so that he can tell his base even the BBC rigged it. That line is already in his Truth Social post. It suits him if the BBC is weakened because it confirms his permanent story. Everybody lied about me. That is why UK politicians should be so careful about sounding as if they support his suit, even if they dislike the BBC's edit. The two things don't go together. So what can be saved, or can it be saved? Well, the answer is cooler than the Spectators. Yes, the BBC can be saved, but only if it stops saying we are not institutionally biased. It needs to get rid of that nonsense. And it needs to start saying this institution has developed habits, ideological, metropolitan, managerial, that pull us in one direction, and we are going to rebalance that on purpose. We're going to try to speak for the country. That's an adult sentence. It's also the sentence people in Salford, Plymouth, Belfast have been waiting to hear. So this line that they all approach the problem with a similar thinking is absolutely right. And exactly the criticism inside the leaked dossier, exactly the criticism from historians about BBC Empire coverage, and exactly the criticism from right-wing channels attacking the BBC. This is the common root, the sameness of mind. And once you see that, The rest of the row looks less like good versus evil, less like right versus left or left versus right, and more like one section of the British media class fighting another for custody of a very large checkbook. And that needs to change. We need to stop thinking about power, and we need to start thinking about providing the service that people are paying for.